As a culture, we are obsessed with fat loss, losing fat, losing weight, fat loss pills. But in today's session, we're going to talk about the importance of lean mass, that is muscle, how muscle is protective and independently associated with reduced risk of all-cause mortality and cancer-specific mortality and even death from heart disease and other causes. Now, this is very important because some strategies that people embark on to lose body mass and lose fat mass actually come at the expense of losing lean muscle mass, which is problematic and may actually increase your risk of all-cause mortality and various diseases. So what I'd like to do today is just encourage you to listen to this with an open mind, because we've been told about all the harmful effects of excess adiposity, of fat tissue. Fat tissue releases all these adipocytokines, leptin and visfatin and resistin. There's all these different inflammatory milieu that's created with excessive, particularly fat around the abdomen. But I want you to hold those biases to the side and just focus on some of these studies. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 different studies that have found, again, independent associations and protective properties linked with muscle tissue, lean muscle mass. And I want you to think about how to reframe your so-called fat loss strategies or your longevity, just the things that you do to improve your health, to focus on preserving that lean mass. Because as the studies that we're going to dive into, one that I'm holding right in my hand here, involved over 55,000 adults, and it tracked these individuals for several different years and found that lean mass, particularly as you get older, is very protective. So we're going to dive into that and talk about a novel way to approach sort of body composition and focusing more on lean mass, not just your BMI, not just how much fat mass you have, the protective properties there. So I think you'll find this quite interesting, and I do just want to give credit to a friend of mine, Gabrielle Lyon. She's been talking about this for a very long time. She's a physician out of New York, and I want to give her credit for planting this seed into a lot of us over the years. Very important, and just a small side plug, you all know that I'm very interested in this, and that's why in 2012, I had this idea to start a company called Myoscience based upon muscle science and preserving lean mass throughout lifespan. So as we get into it, one of the studies that I would like to just dive right into is called, the title here is, and it was published in 2022, is Predicted Fat Mass and Lean Mass in Relation to All-Cause and Cause-Specific Mortality. And so what this study sought to do in 55,000 adults is figure out the independent associations between loss of lean mass and predictions when it comes to early mortality and mortality from specific causes, namely cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other related diseases. And here's what's interesting about this study is they found high adiposity or increased fat mass or low lean mass has been associated with inflammation, metabolic impairments, endothelial dysfunction. The endothelium is the functional unit of your cardiovascular system. So when that is dysfunctional, you get hypertension, high blood pressure, you get cardiovascular disease, erectile dysfunction, so ED, an inability to perform sexually is a problem linked with that. And other cardiovascular disease biomarkers, including high blood pressure and abnormal lipid profile, and all those factors are at greater risk for developing cardiovascular disease and premature death, okay? So again, we know this. It's back in perspective. Too much fat, too little lean muscle mass is linked with all these different problems. But we need to further evaluate and come up with better ways to approximate lean mass in relationship to fat mass, not just focus on the fat mass. And that's what a lot of us have been focusing on for a long time. But we might be wondering, okay, well, why hasn't my doctor talked to me about the importance of my lean mass? And why hasn't my doctor quantified how much lean mass I have? And what should I be doing to improve that? And we're going to definitely talk about solutions here after we introduce the problem. But you might wonder why that hasn't been talked about. It's logistical. It comes down to basic logistics. When you go to the doctor's office, it's usually a nurse or a medical assistant that says, hey, Sally, come on in. Okay, let's hop on the scale. Let's do your height. We're going to do a very crude, rudimentary body mass index, okay? That's going to appropriate, your height to weight and give you this, standardized assessment. And if you're overly muscled and you're short, you're going to be in the obese category, which is crazy, right? So body mass index, as you know, fails to characterize how much lean mass and protective lean tissue is there. So scientists are talking about a lean mass index, and we're going to define and talk about what that is. But other modalities, that can be used to approximate lean mass are bioelectrical impedance, BIA, and then also the DEXA scan. The challenge there is most physicians' offices don't have a DEXA scan that they use. These are generally associated with, believe it or not, fitness centers and health clubs, which is great. And that's, of course, why I was critical about closing gyms, but that's a whole nother conversation. So bioelectrical impedance and bioimpedance analysis, and also DEXA is great for looking at lean mass. And I've done both, and I found they're pretty consistent, right? As long as you're staying hydrated, which we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, we don't hear about muscle because there's no great standardized way to approximate this. And this is why scientists, particularly researchers at NHANES, are utilizing predicted lean mass along with the lean mass index. And they're looking at waist circumference, body weight, and height, and other parameters to account for this. And so in this study, in 55,000 individuals have found independent associations with lean mass, particularly in the young and the elderly, which is important. And those associations are not always there with regards to fat mass. And I think that's important to understand is there is a really interesting U-shaped curve with regards to fat mass, whereas increased fat mass is linked with increased mortality from all causes and cardiovascular and cancer-related causes. But as you get older, there isn't such a strong association over the age of 60. And fat mass may be protective. Now, there are confounding variables, and this might be a little bit of bias in the data in that in people over the age of 60 who have severe, cachexia from diabetes or cancer or heart disease are maybe more cardiometabolically sick than some of the people that are studied. And so therefore they have potentially could have advanced disease, and that's a bias in the data set, a confounder. But anyway, the background data is quite interesting with regards to building up the historical perspective here. There's a study in Danish men and women between the ages of 50 and 64, and several of the studies actually did not observe modifying effects of age in association with fat mass and mortality, while other studies have shown that fat mass appears to be protective against mortality in older adults. So again, there is this interesting cut point. Being obese and morbidly obese and overweight, if you're under the age of 60, is unequivocally linked with mortality, but there's this interesting non-specific association after the age of 60, and it's a little bit sort of this obesity paradox may protect people over the age of 60. So, however, not having enough muscle mass when you get older is a problem. So I want to share with you this data and talk about the risk between low muscle and excessive fat. But first, friends, I just want to welcome you all back as always. I really appreciate you being here, tuning in, and thank you for hitting that like button. Thank you for sharing this video. So we're constantly trying to spread the message about healthy living, about exercise, nutrition, and so forth. So if you have a friend that you know needs to eat a little bit better, like do a little bit more to improve their health, please share this directly as a text message. Also, my friends, as I told you, the impetus to create Myoscience was based upon this data that I've been following for a long time. And I'm excited to share with you solutions that we've been working on for a very long time, including the new electrolyte sticks. What's unique about this is it features some chrononutrients that help support exercise performance, athletic performance, and healthy hydration, like creatine, like taurine. Plus, you also get real salt, salt derived from real Redmond real salt. You get albion chelated minerals, magnesium, potassium, calcium. So this is a great solution for those of you that are trying to be proactive about improving your body composition, getting better recovery from exercise, getting better workouts. The electrolyte sticks can be used before your workout, during the workout, after a sauna session. They're very effective. You can read there's 120 some odd reviews on the website over at myoscience.com. If you're on the fence, check out the reviews, see what other people like you are saying. And if you decide that this is a solution for you, you can save using the coupon code podcast at checkout. I'll link everything below and also in iTunes, so if you're driving. But let's get back to talk about the problems here and some of the tables that make these very interesting associations between, being under muscled and over fat. And we know that, of course, when it comes to death from all causes, respiratory diseases and cancer and cardiovascular disease, we know that increased fat mass is, as I mentioned, particularly for individuals under the age of 60, a problem. And so you can see these positive associations here in the predicted fat mass and mortality from all causes, and also from cancer, okay, and cardiovascular disease. But what's interesting here is individuals who have higher predicted lean mass have greater protection against mortality from these different diseases. So this is important. We can't just continue to vilify fat. You got to lose weight. You got to, go on a diet, right? We hear all that. What about you have to exercise? You have to start doing push-ups and pull-ups and squats and lunges. Like, when are we going to have that conversation at scale to encourage people to not just focus on shedding the fat, but preserving the lean mass? And that, my friends, is the sort of elevator, the 50,000 foot view of this conversation. And again, sort of a culminating summary of the evidence from the academic literature is showing this protective effect. And we see this as a small tangent on this conversation. We see this association with grip strength. Grip strength is a way to approximate in a quick manner whole body strength. Presumably, if you have poor grip strength, then, logic would suggest that maybe you can't push as much, you can't pull as much, you can't get up independently. So there is a strong association in millions of people of low grip strength and increased risk of mortality from all causes. Well, what about just having low muscle mass, right? Because if you have low grip strength, you probably don't have enough muscle mass, right? Because if you're picking stuff up and moving, right, that's going to strengthen your grip strength, right? Even if you're doing leg exercise, you're still using your arms. So there is that association. When's your doctor going to say, "Hey, Sally, let's see how strong is your grip strength?" Or, "Sally, how many times can you get up and down and do a squat in my office?" This could take 90 seconds, right? How winded are you? Or what about gait speed? And this is another sort of a way to approximate how quickly does one walk. In fact, there was an interesting study showing low gait speed was linked with increased risk for severe disease from COVID-19 and actually mortality. So people that, you've been around folks that are in their 50s and you're like, why are you walking so slow? Like, because the balance isn't there or they don't have the muscle mass. So just gait speed. And these are things that, my friends, we can pick up on. Whether you're a physician, whether you work with clients as a nutritionist, or you're in a fitness type setting, or with your friends and family, just notice, hey, how does mom walk from the table to pick up food? It's slow and wobbly and things like that. These little subtle clues can give us hints into how we're going to age, and it comes down to muscle. Because if you're walking really slow because you're worried about falling down, you probably don't have the proprioception and the muscle to maintain that function. So that's why we've done so many videos and podcasts now about muscle mass and exercise and functional training. Because when you train, using and incorporating multiple joints in a functional movement, you're training for life. And I would just say, after reading hundreds of these different studies, all of these studies talk about, when people get older, usually what leads to their mortality is a fall. They fall down, they break a hip, they hit their head, and then they're in a convalescent home and they can't move, and then it's just a downhill slide from there. So that's why I'm harping on this for you, is like, hey, let's prevent that from the get-go with maintaining muscle. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's just summarize this study and then another study in South Korea. So overall, as I mentioned, this was part of the NHANES study, and this is an ongoing large cohort data set. So again, this lean mass index that they used, a little bit crude in a sense because it wasn't a direct bioimpedance analysis or DEXA, but because there's so many subjects in this study and they clump subjects into quartiles and quintiles, we can infer some of the big picture changes here. But 55,000 subjects showed they found a strong and inverse association between predicted lean mass and mortality from all causes: cardiovascular disease, cancer, and respiratory disease. In contrast, both higher and low predicted fat mass were associated with higher risk of mortality from all causes and cardiovascular disease. Wait, let's just go back and let's read that again. In contrast, both higher and lower predicted fat mass, okay? So it turns out, my friends, you can be fit and fat at the same time. I know some people are like, they're bigger boned, they're a little bit heavier. Embrace it. Embrace it, my friends. Don't obsess over the scale and all of this, because it turns out that it matters, and I know it sounds repetitive, where your fat is distributed. Abdominal fat is the problem. If you have a bigger rear, right, you get fat on the back of the triceps or on the hamstrings, that is not as metabolically and damaging for the immune system and for the metabolism and the cardiovascular system. It's really the abdominal fat. And that's a reflection of insulin resistance and other factors. But that's the important thing here is we found there's a strong inverse association with lean mass and mortality, but there's this interesting U-shaped curve with fat mass. So it's not always bad because it matters where the fat is distributed and also the age. So again, I think that should be refreshing for some people because the zeitgeist of our culture focuses so much on fat mass. But if we could just reframe that person by person through conversations to harp and really indelibly ink in people's minds the importance of lean mass, okay? So going on, they say, while higher predicted fat mass was associated with higher risk of mortality from cancer and respiratory diseases, they also say that their age significantly modified the relationship between predicted fat mass and all-cause mortality. And lean mass was modified by age as well, meaning low lean mass as you get older is very inversely and tightly inversely correlated with all-cause mortality. So you're frail, you're in your 60s, you're one fall away from the end of your life, which is not good, okay? And so this is why now we should work on the pushing and the pulling, the resistance training, using multi-joint compound movements to mimic daily living, okay? So very interesting data. Again, this was just one study in 55,000 subjects, but it corroborates with other studies that have found and used direct ways to sort of ascertain lean mass using DEXA measurements and also bioimpedance analysis and so forth, showing that the fat-free mass index is inversely associated with mortality. And so they go on to say, overall, although the relations between fat mass and lean mass with mortality are still inconclusive, these large-scale studies suggest that fat mass that is relatively too high and lean mass that is relatively too low are both associated with increased risk for all-cause mortality. Based on a large nationally representative cohort of U.S. adults, our current study further supports the above-mentioned findings. Okay, so again, it's hard to do these studies because we don't have enough people that have had DEXA scans. Like these are things that are sort of athletes in the know do it because they know, but most people are like, a DEXA? Do you want to know how my bone mineral density is? No, it's like, I want to know how much lean mass you have, like, and where your fat is distributed. Now, the challenge with a DEXA is it is a low dose of radiation. I believe it's an ionizing type radiation that is similar to an X-ray, but it's a much smaller, quantitatively speaking, a dose of radiation, but it still is radiation. And this is why people will say, well, if you're checking in weekly, you might want to do a bioimpedance analysis, like the in-body type scan. Okay, so finishing up here, the authors say in this particular study, we found that both higher levels of fat mass and lower levels of lean mass were associated with higher risks of mortality from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and respiratory diseases, which is consistent with previous studies in American men. And by the way, heart disease, cancer, lung disease are the top causes of death. Behind, there's also neurodegenerative diseases in there, and then also autoimmunity. But we do know that autoimmunity is linked with excessive fat mass. Okay, so going on, this study is about 12 years old, but these authors introduce and piggyback off the emerging data about the lean mass index. And again, this was, just so you understand the data set, this was, I think, 2,000 elderly Asians. The title of the study here is Lean Mass Index, a better predictor of mortality than body mass in elderly Asians. And so they created this the people who have developed this lean mass index is basically a way to look at body composition, including how much lean mass there is in kilograms, how much fat mass there is in fat mass proportions, using bioimpedance analysis. And so it's indexed similarly to BMI in kilograms over meters squared. So it's similar in that regard. And generally what they found is in these quintiles of people, so they clustered people into different buckets, that higher lean mass in elderly people was more protective, like we've been talking about. But I want to share with you some tables and some more information because I think this is quite interesting. But they followed these individuals for over 3.5 years. And during that period of time, about 55 elderly folks had died. And so, they had data before. They tracked them for about 3.5 years and found waist circumference, fat mass, and fat proportion were not associated with mortality. My friends, we've been talking about this. Remember, the data set is elderly Asians, okay, elderly people. But it's important to know, as a society, and most health professionals will say, you need to lose fat. But as you see in this data set of people over the age of 65, fat mass and even fat proportion wasn't associated with mortality. But here's what they found. In contrast, there was an association with lean mass and the lean mass index and mortality. That's important, my friends. So again, it's not just about your fat. We know fat's generally not a good thing, right? But it's more about muscle. So are you starting to see here? I know I'm maybe being a little bit repetitive, but I think it's important to just constantly ink this in your mind and share with you this data that is over 12 years old at this point in time, that studies have found that lean mass is inversely associated with mortality. But in elderly subjects, fat mass is not necessarily proportionally increased with mortality. There's people with low fat mass that die of early age and chronic disease. There's also people with high fat mass, but the data is consistent. Lean mass is inversely associated with mortality. So low lean mass, higher mortality, higher lean mass, lower rates of mortality. Does that make sense? So they go on to say there's no interaction here between men and women with regards to lean mass parameters and all-cause mortality. So there wasn't any gender bias. I think that's important. However, they group people into tertiles, and what they found is that participants in lean mass group 3 had a relative risk of mortality that was 74% lower than group 1. So this is important to understand. So they group people into 3 buckets, right? Lowest lean mass, moderate, and high, essentially, okay, in this data set of roughly 2,000 people. So the relative risk of mortality in people who had the highest lean mass in relationship to the group that had the lowest lean mass was 74% lower, okay? So this is the relative risk between the groups. And I don't know the absolute risk of mortality in this different data set. But that, I think, is quite important. Like we hear about statistics and all these things, especially with COVID, 95% efficacy and all this. Well, a 74% lower risk of mortality, comparing people who have higher lean mass compared to people who have lower lean mass. To me, that's pretty important. And that underscores the importance of exercise, of eating enough protein. And that's where I want to sort of finish up here. We know now how problematic low lean mass is. So what do I do? And I want to finish up with that and just share with you just one final sort of statement here. Is these authors say, several studies have found a positive correlation between BMI and all-cause mortality in young adults, but not focusing so much on the elderly population. In this present study, lean mass parameters, what they posit as the lean mass index, rather than body mass index, was a significant risk factor for all-cause mortality in elderly Asians over a 3.5-year period. So I think this is important to know that other parameters related to body composition are independently linked with mortality and death. And so they go on and share a bunch of different things in that particular study and talk about some details. And there's been subsequent follow-up studies that we'll talk about later. But now that you know about the importance of muscle, right? What do? Like, I can't give you everything in like 5 minutes here, but here's what I would say. And I like to encourage my clients. You need to sort of target, or for using, bodybuilding bro jargon, hit every major muscle group 1 day per week. Now, it doesn't have to be all in 1 day. Spread out the fatigue over the course of a week. But some sort of if you want to think of bro split bodybuilding, think of upper body pressing, lower body pressing, lower body pulling, upper body pulling, splitting, sort of bifurcating your workouts based upon, if you could cut your body part into, the sagittal and the anterior, posterior side. So, you're hitting the front part of your upper body 1 day, and then maybe the front part of your lower body the next day, taking a break, doing the reverse on a Thursday. You're hitting the back part of your body. That would be the pulling, the rows, the shrugs, the carries, all of the, posterior side of your upper body and back. And then on that subsequent 4th day, you could do the posterior chain type work, which is more glute focused, more hamstring focused, more the posterior side of your body. These are the deadlifts. These are the hip thrusts. These are the hip hinges. These are the reverse hypers. These are the leg presses. These are the lunges. So, you can sort of Google what are some good exercises for the front of your legs? What are good exercises for the back of your legs? Now, I love resistance training and I love functional training. You might quite like yoga. You might like to garden. You might like to do these different things. I want you to sort of do the types of exercises that work best for you and your body and the things that you like to do. So find a partner who's more physically fit than you, a friend, a neighbor, someone that you see at the gym, and start to train with them. That is the best way to improve your functional fitness. If you hang out with people who are more physically fit than you, you're going to start behaving like them. You're going to learn their exercises. Do you have a rest day after we do this? Oh, what are you eating in the post-workout window? What does your recovery look like? What time do you go to bed? Are you drinking alcohol, after a workout, or having pizza? Or are you going home and having a steak or whatever, a vegan protein if you're a vegetarian or vegan, right? So these are the things that we need to start to do. And I can't prescribe you all of this in 5 minutes, but I will just tell you one great way to get started is to sort of split your body into upper body pulling, upper body pressing, lower body pulling, lower body pressing. Okay. And that's a great way to get started, or hire a personal trainer, someone who is a certified strength and conditioning specialist, a CSCS. Now, they don't have to be. There's great trainers that aren't certified strength and conditioning specialists, but that individuals who go on to get that certification have really studied the body and periodization and programming and really know what they're doing. CrossFit, it can be a great way to sort of get started as well. Functional training is great as well too. So a hybrid approach, but the most important thing is to pick a modality of exercise, whether it's body weight exercises or bodybuilding or powerlifting, something that you enjoy. If you don't like going to the gym, figure out solutions for you that you can do at home. Invest in some minimal equipment, bands, kettlebells. But the important thing here is instead of focusing on, I need to go for a run for 45 minutes to burn fat, focus on, I need to incorporate resistance training to maintain and build muscle. That is, my friend, the mindset shift. Focus instead on, oh, I burned 300 calories during this exercise session to, oh my gosh, I am now hitting 1,200 watts when I do sprints on my bike, okay? This power is more important than burning calories, okay? And we've talked about this with the Caro bike and other modalities where we've talked about incorporating power into the exercise session as opposed to just focusing on the calorie burn. Really important stuff. So hopefully you found this helpful. I will link some of the articles in the show notes and associated videos that we've done with Sean Baker, Gabrielle Lyon to help you again. I feel like because for decades we've been taught about the problems associated with fat and increased fat mass and all the issues with visceral fat, but we haven't yet sort of been taught, and we need to reframe to focus more on preserving that lean skeletal muscle because it's so important for metabolic health, for preventing falls and catastrophic events, and also supporting independent living as we get older. So hopefully you found this content helpful. As always, I'd be grateful if you could share this with a friend or family member. Leave us some feedback on iTunes if you're listening in iTunes, and thank you for hitting that like button over on YouTube, and we'll catch you all on a future episode down the road. Have a good one now.